The chronometers aboard Temporal Sanctity chimed in perfect unison as we dropped from warp translation, each timepiece registering the exact same timestamp that 9 previous Imperial expeditions had recorded upon approaching this cursed sector. 847.M41, 127th day, 142307 Imperial Standard. A moment frozen in the amber of impossibility, repeated across centuries with the precision of a funeral bell. I am Chronos Adept Vex Malleus, and I have witnessed time itself caught in the teeth of a cosmic mechanism that refuses to acknowledge the Emperor's dominion over causality. The litany of fixed interval rose unbidden to my lips as I stood before the primary observation port, watching the Hadron Nexus writhe in defiance of every principle inscribed in the Ordo Chronos archives. The warp storm surrounding Forge World Tertius 9 burned with cobalt lightning that formed perfect geometric patterns, 9-sided figures pulsing in mathematical sequences, each flash lasting exactly 11.1 seconds before reforming in identical configuration. For 999 standard years, this tempest had maintained its precise formation, neither expanding nor contracting, as if the very concept of temporal progression had been surgically excised from local space-time. Bridge humidity held at parade dry levels, the recycled air tasting of ozone and old incense with an undertone that made my teeth ache. The metallic flavour of chronometric distortion bleeding through the ship's atmospheric processes. Captain Lord René's voice crackled through the Voxnet as he reported successful emergence at high anchor, but his words arrived 3 seconds before his lips moved, creating an echo that preceded its source like a prayer spoken backward. My chronolith, a shard of null crystal suspended in sanctified oils, began to hum against my chest, its resonance matching the storm's pulse with uncomfortable precision. The temperature in the observation deck dropped 7 degrees in as many seconds, and frost began forming on the viewport in patterns that mirrored the tempest's geometry. 9-pointed stars within 9-pointed stars, creating a fractal recursion that hurt to perceive directly, as if the human eye were not meant to witness such mathematical perfection. The astropathic choir reported contact with something broadcasting from the storm's heart. Not a distress signal, but a countdown in high Gothic that burned itself into their minds like acid etching on copper plates. Servitor Scribe Hexus approached with trembling mechadendrites, offering a data slate containing translated fragments. The Gothic phrases made my skin crawl with their terrible familiarity. Temporal anchor established. Causality matrix stable. The 9th iteration commences as prophesied. My personal chronometer, a relic of ancient Mechanicus design, began to vibrate against my wrist. Its minute hand juddered, then skipped, then snapped backward by a full hour before resuming its forward march as if nothing had occurred. The device's brass casing grew cold to the touch, and when I lifted it to my ear, I could hear the faint sound of gears grinding against temporal resistance. Through the reinforced transparisteel, Tertius 9 showed through gaps in the cobalt web. A manufactorum plane frozen mid-shift, conveyor systems stilled, god engines holding their heads tilted like hounds scenting prey. Every few moments, lightning would run backward along a tower's height, uncharring metal to brightness, and I witnessed a spire collapse that ended in its own beginning. The astropaths swayed as one, blood beading at the corners of their mouths before turning to frost on their skin, forming fern-like patterns that branched into 9-sided geometries. Their chorister prime raised 2 trembling fingers in the sign of silence, whispering through cracked lips, "Do not answer." The storm's voice is an answer awaiting its question. My vox bead crackled with sudden life, the signal threading through layers of chronometric interference with surgical precision. The authentication codes matched my personal cipher perfectly, rendered in my own terrible, precise habit of letter spacing. When the voice emerged from the static, it was unmistakably my own, weary, drained, speaking with the ritualistic cadence of a man who had completed an impossible duty. Temporal sanctity. This is Adept Malleus reporting mission success. Entry achieved at 0-3. Quorum established. Do not fire into Axis 9 or you will complete the loop. A pause filled with the sound of breath I recognized as mine, aged by experiences I had not yet endured. Listen to me. You must set the locks now, or you will become us. The transmission cut to static, leaving me staring at my reflection in the frost-covered viewport. Behind my image, the cobalt storm pulsed 9 times in rapid succession, and I realized, with growing horror, that each flash corresponded to a heartbeat. Not mine, but something vast and patient that had been counting down to this moment for nearly a millennium. The countdown continued its inexorable march towards 0, and I understood with crystalline clarity that I was not approaching a destination, but a beginning that had already ended 9 times before. The echo of my own voice reporting mission success in events yet to occur lingered in the Vox static as Captain Lord Rene ordered descent protocols initiated without requesting explanation. Perhaps he understood, as I was beginning to, that conventional causality had been surgically excised from this sector of space. The temporal sanctity shuddered as her plasma drives engaged, their harmonic frequency immediately synchronizing with the storm's pulse. A deep, subsonic hum that vibrated through deck plating and into the marrow of every soul aboard. Inquisitor Thane materialized beside me at the observation port, his presence announced by the sudden stillness that fell over nearby chronometers. His face bore the ritual scars of temporal exposure, fine lines that seemed to shift when observed peripherally, as if time itself had carved its passage into his flesh. When he spoke, reality hesitated around him, creating brief afterimages that suggested he existed in multiple moments simultaneously. "We adjust the ship's language to match the storm's grammar," he said, his words arriving with the metallic taste of old copper. "Causality here operates in reverse. Effects precede causes, answers await their questions." Dominus Keth's Skitari Maniple Alpha moved through the corridors in perfect formation, their augmetic limbs clicking against deck plating in rhythms that matched the cobalt lightning's pulse. The tech priest stood 7 feet tall beneath crimson robes bearing the cogtooth of Mars, his optical mechadendrites tracking environmental readings that defied every principle of imperial science. When he spoke, his Vox grill produced harmonics that made nearby metal surfaces vibrate like struck tuning forks, and I noticed servitors throughout the ship beginning to twitch in response to frequencies that existed outside normal temporal flow. Colonel Voss of the Death Corps, 447th, maintained parade discipline despite the growing wrongness infecting every system. His regiment's gas masks reflected the storm's glow through viewports, creating an army of faceless sentinels whose breathing apparatus hissed in unison. The Kriegmen stood motionless at their posts, their silence more unnerving than any battle cry as the ship's hull began resonating with frequencies that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the brainstem. As we descended toward Tertius 9, the storm shifted in response to our approach. Cobalt lightning reshaped itself into non-agonal patterns that bloomed where our bow would be before we moved there, then obligingly moved to meet us. Each 9-sided glyph rotated to align with our thrusters, anticipating micro-adjustments of our course. The storm was not resisting our approach, it was coaching us into a position already chosen. The ship's machine spirits began receiving navigational data from sources that should not exist. Servitor Scribe Hexus approached with trembling mechadendrites, offering data slates showing impossible readings, fuel consumption reports from vessels destroyed centuries ago, crew manifests updating in real time with names of the long dead, maintenance schedules for ships reduced to stellar debris before my grandfather's birth. Flight plans signed with the sigils of expeditions 2 through 9 slid into our navigation buffers with the confidence of remembered keys. A metallic taste coated every tongue aboard, while crew members reported phantom litanies whispered at the edge of auditory perception, chants in languages that predated Imperial Gothic, resonant with terrible antiquity. I recognized tonal patterns from forbidden Mechanicus archives, prayers to forgotten deities of time and entropy. This was sensory, bleed-through from the storm's chronometric anchor points, 9 specific positions where time flowed at wildly divergent rates, creating temporal pressure differentials that threatened reality's fabric. Telemetry revealed Tertius 9 locked in perpetual twilight, its manufactorums still operating despite no detectable population. Conveyor systems moved in endless loops, carrying nothing from nowhere to nowhere, while massive god engines stood sentinel over empty courtyards. 9 orbital platforms hung in perfect formation, broadcasting identical energy signatures. 9 towering spires rose from the primary hive complex, their heights precisely calibrated to form non-agonal patterns when viewed from orbit. 9 distinct power sources pulsed in synchronization with the storm, their mathematical sequences painful to contemplate. My chronolith grew so cold against my chest that frost began forming on my uniform in crystalline patterns, matching the storm's geometric precision. The astropathic choir swayed in their restraint thrones, blood streaming from their eyes as they passed signals arriving before being sent. Then, the primary Auspex display flickered. Our own ship appeared not as one vessel, but as 9 identical signatures occupying the same coordinates simultaneously. The tactical screen showed a ghostly armada of temporal sanctities superimposed upon one another, each one a testament to journeys made and unmade countless times before. We were not approaching Tertius 9 for the first time, but returning to complete a circuit running for nearly a millennium, each expedition adding another layer to a temporal mechanism that grew more complex with every iteration. The Aquila landers descended through Tertius 9's perpetual twilight, their retro thrusters stirring dust that had settled into perfect geometric patterns across the landing platform, designated Theta 9. As the assault ramps lowered with pneumatic sighs, we stepped into the impossible reality of Omnissiah's recursion, a forge city operating in flawless mechanical harmony despite the complete absence of human life. The air tasted of sanctified oils and ozone, with an undertone that made my chronolith vibrate against my chest, while the subsonic hum of the storm above translated through ferrocrete into bone-deep resonance. Servo skulls drifted through predetermined flight paths with the precision of funeral rites, their optical sensors tracking maintenance schedules for structures that required no maintenance. I watched one skeletal construct polish the same section of brass railing for exactly 9 minutes before gliding to its next waypoint, its movements calibrated to microsecond precision. Servitors shuffled through their eternal duties, augmetic limbs performing tasks for masters who had been dust for centuries, their mechanical devotion creating a symphony of industry without purpose. Colonel Voss deployed the Death Corps 447th in overlapping fields of fire, their gas masks reflecting the city's amber glow, while lasguns tracked servo skulls that posed no conceivable threat. The Kriegmen understood duty without requiring explanation, and their disciplined silence complemented the mechanical chorus surrounding us, the rhythmic hammering of automated forges, the whisper of conveyor belts carrying nothing from nowhere to nowhere, and the deep thrumming of power generators feeding systems that served no living purpose. When Voss measured the perimeter, he discovered that every approach to our position required exactly 81 steps, regardless of the route taken. Dominus Keth approached the nearest data terminal with reverent precision, his mechadendrites interfacing with ports that sparked at his touch. Binary hymns flowed from his vox grill as he communed with machine spirits that responded with impossible complexity. His optical sensors flickered between spectrums, while sacred oils wept from his joints, and when he spoke, the nearby servo skulls paused mid-flight as if listening. The city operates under 9 distinct command protocols from different temporal epochs, he reported, his words making nearby metal surfaces ring like struck bells. Pre-Unity schema, Great Crusade directives, Heresy-era patches, and protocols from expeditions that have not yet departed Terra. The machine spirits obey them all simultaneously, creating operational paradoxes that somehow resolve into perfect function. The architecture defied conventional geometry as we penetrated deeper into the city's heart. Corridors looped back upon themselves without retracing ground, creating impossible spaces where we could observe our own approach from the opposite direction. A manufacturer extruded ferrocrete components that fed directly into assembly halls, which reissued the materials as conveyor housings that returned to the same press, creating recursive manufacturing cycles that had been running for nearly a millennium. The system devoured and birthed itself in perfect economy, consuming possibility rather than raw materials. Cogitator banks throughout the complex processed data in temporal spirals, their calculations creating feedback loops that generated increasing complexity with each iteration. I observed data tapes emerging from readers, looping through brass guides, and vanishing into punch assemblies where future perforations aligned perfectly with present holes. Status lamps displayed timestamps in 9 different formats, including codes that the Collegia Titanica had not yet developed. Atmospheric pressure held steady at exactly 9 degrees above freezing as we moved through empty hab blocks that stretched in perfect rows. Their windows glowed with artificial warmth, while meals sat half-eaten on tables. Protein loaves cross-sectioned into precise wedges. Cups of recaf steaming in eternal twilight without ever cooling or developing surface films. A child's tin soldiers stood at attention on a metal grate, their tiny banner fixed at a right angle to breath that had never been drawn. The preservation was absolute, creating the antiseptic absence of decay where entropy should have flourished. Voxcasters throughout the complex broadcast shift changes with mechanical precision, their announcements delivered in high Gothic and a dust-dry tongue older than imperial records. Second shift reports to Manufactorum 777. Third shift assumes positions at Bell 9. Blessed be the Omnissiah's eternal labour. The voices called out names of workers who had not existed for centuries, their manufactured cheer more unsettling than screams would have been. Inquisitor Thane moved through the empty streets like a man walking through his own memories, his temporal scars shifting with each change of light. When servo skulls approached him, they hesitated mid-flight, as if recognizing something impossible, then continued their routes with mechanical confusion written in their optical adjustments. Keth's deeper investigations revealed fragments of Project Eternal Recursion in the city's data archives, research protocols bearing the seal of Magos Biologis Xerion 9, a name that appeared in manufacturing schedules, personnel rosters, and experimental documentation spanning 3 centuries. The timestamps showed impossible overlap, suggesting Xerion 9 had maintained presence during every iteration of the project, while somehow remaining absent from all recorded imperial history. The recurring motif of 9 appeared everywhere we looked. The city's radial layout divided into 9 primary sectors. Power distribution flowed through 9 main conduits, and the precise distance between any 2 major structures required exactly 99 paces to traverse. Even the automated systems operated on 9-hour cycles, creating mathematical precision that suggested deliberate design rather than architectural coincidence. As we approached the central district, a massive spire rose from the heart of the forge complex, its height precisely aligned with the storm's eye above. Servo skulls circled the structure in formations that matched the Cobalt Lightning's geometry, while automated lift platforms carried empty cargo containers to predetermined floors with the regularity of a heartbeat. The spire's entrance bore no lock, no seal, no impediment, only a portal that opened at our approach as if our arrival had been calculated into its operational parameters centuries in advance. Beyond lay a central shaft containing 9 identical laboratories arranged in vertical succession around a non-agonal axis. Through reinforced viewports, I observed identical workstations bearing the same equipment, the same specimens, the same data slates. But each laboratory existed frozen at different stages of the same experiment, creating a vertical timeline of scientific progression that defied every principle of causality the Ordo Chronos had taught me to understand. At the highest gallery, a sealed sarcophagus waited with its chronodial stopped at a timestamp that imperial records insisted had not yet come to pass. The first laboratory unlocked at our approach with a sigh of equalizing pressure, releasing air that tasted of sanctified oils old copper, and preservative tinctures that numbed my tongue on contact. Dominus Keth's mechadendrites blossomed around the control terminals with reverent precision, each interface connection producing a faint bell tone that descended through 9 notes like a funeral cadence. The chamber's non-agonal layout framed a central stasis cot, where a specimen lay beneath crystalline vac seals, its flesh pale as temple wax and cross-hatched with the ritual scarification of Mars. The thing should not have been alive, yet persistently was. Its chest rose once every 9 minutes with mechanical precision, while veins glowed with faint bioluminescence that flowed backward toward the heart, paused, then trickled forward again in defiance of circulatory logic. One lung displayed the mottled stiffness of extreme age, while the other remained fetal purple, their temporal states existing simultaneously within the same ribcage. When I observed the creature's open jaw, its teeth showed 3 distinct enamel sheens layered like geological strata: infant milk white, adult permanence, and the brittle chalk of advanced age, all occupying the same dental structure. We ascended through the spire's central shaft, each laboratory revealing increasingly horrific iterations of Magos biologist Zerion 9's research into what his data slates termed chronometric biologics. Laboratory 2 contained specimens whose skeletal structures existed in multiple temporal phases simultaneously, femurs producing ghost bones that overlapped the real in shimmering superposition. The phantom structures resolved into earlier and later morphologies when Keth increased the luminance, creating evolutionary timelines compressed into single organisms. Their ribcages clicked autonomously, each sound marking seconds that had not yet been spent. Temporal displacement symptoms began crawling under my skin like chilled insects as we progressed deeper into Zerion 9's work. The taste of copper intensified until I could feel letters forming against my palate, syllables I had never learned pressing at my tongue with urgent familiarity. For brief moments I existed elsewhere, listening to my own voice instructing me to lock Axis 9, walking corridors I had never traversed, making tactical decisions I had never considered. My hands moved with muscle memory of actions I had not performed, reaching for controls whose functions I should not have known. Laboratory 3 housed creatures whose nervous systems had bifurcated into temporal helixes, transparent neural sheathing revealing axons braided between now and not yet. The specimen's eyes tracked our movement with lagging horror, tears forming not in the present, but remembered from futures we had not yet inflicted upon them. Medici cogitators throughout the chamber played back-recorded pain spikes with timestamps that matched no calendar in imperial records, their data streams flowing backward through time like prayers spoken in reverse. Colonel Voss's reports filtered through the Voxnet with increasing urgency as his Death Corps squads encountered spatial anomalies throughout the lower levels. Rooms existed only when directly observed by 2 or more troopers, collapsing into blank ferrocrete when attention shifted elsewhere. Staircases led to different destinations depending on the precise chronometer reading. Passages traversed at 14:23:07 opened onto armories, while the same routes taken at 14:23:08 revealed laboratories that should have been 3 levels higher. The Kriegmen adapted to impossible architecture with characteristic discipline, marking waypoints that shifted position between observations. Dominus Keth's augmetic systems began producing cascading errors as we ascended higher in the spire. His optical mechadendrites twitched with increasing frequency, while his vox grill emitted fragments of Binharic hymns delivered in reverse chronological order. Data transmissions from the other 8 expedition iterations flooded his cognitive matrices, creating feedback loops that made his entire frame shudder with mechanical distress. Sacred oils leaked from his joints in patterns matching the storm's geometry, while his chronometer displays cycled through 9 different timestamps in rapid succession. Through reinforced viewports, Laboratory 5 revealed the first successful temporal anchor, a creature that had once been human but now existed as a living chronometric stabilizer. Its consciousness had been distributed across 9 stasis chambers simultaneously, each section aging at different rates while maintaining neural connectivity through biomechanical interfaces that pulsed with the storm's rhythm. The entity's biological functions had been reduced to essential temporal operations: circulation systems that pumped time instead of blood, respiratory apparatus that breathed possibility rather than atmosphere. Telemetry readings throughout the city showed chronometric instability, spreading from the spire's base in concentric waves. Servo skulls began executing flight patterns from different temporal iterations simultaneously, creating aerial traffic that existed in superposition. Automated systems cycled through operational modes from past, present, and potential future configurations as multiple timelines attempted to assert dominance over the same physical space. The readings scrolled across my retinal implant with increasing urgency, chronometric variance rising, anchor points desynchronizing, warp pressure holding at stable negative, while urban systems maintained 99% functionality despite zero civilian biosigns. Laboratory 8 contained specimens that had transcended biological existence entirely, becoming pure temporal phenomena housed in containment fields that bent light into impossible angles. Their consciousness persisted as mathematical equations written in living tissue, processing information at frequencies that existed outside normal time flow. When I attempted direct observation, my chronolith grew so cold it burned through my uniform, leaving frost patterns that matched the creature's neural configurations. The final laboratory remained sealed behind blast doors bearing Zerion 9's personal seal, a 9-pointed star surrounding the cogtooth of Mars, inscribed with warning sigils in languages that predated human speech. Keth's mechadendrites interfaced with the locking mechanism while his Vox grill produced harmonics that made the entire spire resonate like a struck tuning fork. The chamber beyond contained an empty stasis coffin, its seals frosted from within, and a single data crystal resting in a devotional niche beneath the defaced sigil of Mars. The crystal activated at Keth's touch, filling the chamber with Zerion 9's voice, worn smooth by repetition, speaking in Binharic and Low Gothic, layered together like competing prayers. Iteration 9. Successful anchor ignition. The subject stabilized the storm's perimeter through paradox absorption. Unintended consequence, the anchor learns. It resolves causality by recursion, converting event chains into loops to preserve coherence. System entrained. We are contained within a living equation. The recording continued with the wet sound of a mouth that had forgotten water. The entity persists in Subforge Gamma beneath Omnissiah's recursion. It is still alive. It does not die. It will not let us leave until we complete it again. The crystal clicked silent, leaving us in darkness that seemed to listen. Somewhere far below us, something breathed once, slowly, like a bellows remembering fire, the sound of a living temporal paradox that had achieved perfect chronometric stability by trapping the entire system in an unending loop, feeding on the recursive causality it had created to birth itself into eternal life. The descent into Subforge Gamma began through a maintenance lift that defied rational operation, its brass cage descending and ascending in the same motion, while floor counters ticked through numerals that counted both up and down without contradiction. The air thickened into something you could chew, saturated with preservative vapors and the metallic bite of chronometric bleed that made my chronolith throb against my chest like a second heart. Zerion 9's coordinates led us through corridors arranged in a non-agonal pattern that refused to close, each passage arching away at angles that made the eye water, their geometry singing hymns to impossibility. Where the spire's laboratories had presented controlled blasphemies under sterile conditions, the Chronarch's underground domain was wild sacrament made manifest in ferrocrete and shadow. The architecture abandoned all pretense of Euclidean logic as walls held rivets that were simultaneously stars, and passages bent back upon themselves without retracing ground. I witnessed the first impossible sight as we entered a vast subterranean plaza where 8 other expeditions moved through their missions in perfect synchronization with ours, their forms translucent as oil on water, yet solid when observed directly. Temporal echoes began bleeding through the plaza's acoustic properties as sounds from past expeditions layered with present audio input. A shouted order arrived as its own echo, followed by the original voice crackling through vox static that tasted of copper and old prayers. Lass fire cracked like ice breaking underwater, while the clang of dropped magazines rang out before the equipment hit ferrocrete. In the corner of my vision, a grenade rolled to a stop, pitted and smoking, except the smoke flowed inward as if inhaled by time's lungs, and the pin reinserted itself with a delicate click that preceded the explosion it prevented. Colonel Voss's Death Corps maintained formation alongside identical squads from different iterations, their disciplined silence more unnerving as phantom wounds began manifesting across their ranks. One trooper's sleeve darkened with blood that had not yet spilled, the tourniquet already applied by hands still lifting to tie it. Sergeant Corrin's face bore stress lines from prolonged siege warfare, while his chronometer insisted only 4 hours had elapsed since deployment. The Medicae attaché pressed sealant to holes in rib cages that healed forward into our timeline from battles fought in potential futures. Dominus Keth staggered under the weight of 9 competing data transmissions stamping commands into his cortex, augury streams from other iterations of himself screaming through his synapses like blizzards of crystalline static. Binary hymns spilled from his vox grill in reverse chronological order, then in palindromes that softened the ferrocrete beneath our boots. When he stabbed a mechadendrite into a wall port to anchor himself, the connection spat sparks in 9 colors, one of which existed outside normal visual spectrum, but whose taste was iron and cold prayer. The Chronarch servants emerged from alcoves that existed only when approached from specific angles, their appearances defying every principle of imperial biology. They had once been human members of previous expeditions, but exposure to non-linear existence had fractured their consciousness across multiple temporal states. One woman approached with the measured gait of a seasoned officer, her left eye bright with youth, while her right was clouded with the cataracts of extreme age. They wore uniforms from different eras, Great Crusade void armor beside Hive PDF dusters, Heresy-era plate lacquered in forgotten colors, next to void suits bearing sealant stamps dated centuries in the future. Each servant bore Zerion 9's brand burned into flesh at different stages of scarification, and each claimed to be the first expedition, their voices overlapping with multiple inflections as they delivered reports from missions that had ended before beginning. Their minds had been abraded by temporal exposure until only the identity of primacy remained. Consciousness scattered across the chronometric spectrum like light through a prism made of broken time. Inquisitor Thane drew us into the shelter of a broken conveyor housing that was simultaneously a shrine from another century, his temporal scars deepening as he absorbed the ambient chronometric chaos. His rosette glowed with energies that created brief gaps in the overlapping realities surrounding us. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute authority. "The loop expands with each iteration," he declared, harmonics making the plaza's architecture shift in response. What began as containment of a single forge world now threatens entire sectors. The Chronarch feeds on causality itself, converting linear progression into recursive stability. If we fail to break the cycle, the phenomenon will achieve critical mass and begin consuming time on a galactic scale. The recurring motif of 9 had transformed from mathematical curiosity into sinister prophecy written in flesh and circumstance. 9 previous expeditions, 9 temporal phases operating simultaneously. 9 possible outcomes to our mission that somehow all led to the same recursive conclusion. The plaza's non-agonal layout focused chronometric energies toward a central depression, where 9 identical stairwells descended toward the Chronarch's core domain, each existing in different temporal phases while leading to the same destination through different moments in causality. As we approached the central descent, My auger ticker detected 9 contacts advancing on our position in perfect tactical formation. The iconography matched our own signatures down to weapon configurations and caloric profiles, but the readings arrived 3 seconds before visual confirmation. Through the shimmer of temporal distortion, figures resolved from the air itself, ourselves, wearing the same equipment, bearing identical scars, moving with tactical precision that mirrored our own training. Las fire erupted from positions we had not yet occupied as both sides responded to threats that existed in recursive superposition. I took cover behind a pillar that was also a timeline, while staccato bursts stitched the air from competing vectors, impacts sparking from breastplates in the same locations with heartbeat timing. The engagement transcended conventional tactics, as I observed my own form crouched behind defensive positions, laser gun raised in perfect firing stance, while muzzle flashes illuminated a face-bearing scars I had not yet received. Colonel Voss coordinated fire patterns with versions of himself from different iterations, while his troopers engaged enemies, wearing identical uniforms and regimental markings. We fought ourselves across multiple timelines simultaneously, each iteration convinced of its own temporal primacy, while contributing to a battle that could neither be won nor lost. I met my own eyes across the plaza, the other me pivoting to sight, lips forming caution half a breath before mine. We fired at once, trigger brakes synchronized, muzzle flashes merged, and I understood, with terrible clarity, that we were completing a circuit the Chronarch had drawn with our own hands, the temporal loop tightening one click closer to zero through the mathematics of self-destruction. The firefight collapsed into temporal stasis when Inquisitor Thane raised his rosette and spoke a word that existed in 9 languages simultaneously. The suspended las bolts flickered like dying stars before dissolving into probability streams, while our temporal duplicates became translucent as oil on water before fading entirely. The plaza settled into an oppressive quiet, broken only by the distant hum of the Chronarch's breathing, a sound that seemed to emanate from the Ferrocrete itself. Thane's confession emerged with the weight of absolute authority, his temporal scars deepening as chronometric pressure focused upon him like the attention of a vast patient predator. The Chronarch was not an accident, he declared, his words making the plaza's nonagonal architecture shift in response to their gravity. It was commissioned by the Ordo Chronos as Project Eternal Recursion, an attempt to weaponize time itself against the archenemies of mankind. Xerion 9 was our chosen architect, tasked with creating a temporal anchor that could rewrite history in the Emperor's favor. Dominus Keth's mechadendrites interfaced with Xerion 9's personal cogitator, the device screaming binharic hymns that made nearby Ferrocrete weep sanctified oils. Data cascaded through the air in 9 overlapping streams, each revealing a different facet of the horrifying truth. The Chronarch existed in 9 temporal states simultaneously, its consciousness distributed across multiple potential outcomes of the Great Crusade. In one timeline, the Warmaster never fell and humanity expanded in golden light. In another, Horus ascended and the stars died like closing eyes. Each iteration represented a different historical branch point, all threaded together by an entity that fed on their contradictions. My chronolith burned against my chest with cold fire as the implications crystallized like frost forming impossible patterns. The warp storms surrounding Tertius 9 were not containing the entity. They were feeding it, drawing power from temporal paradoxes to fuel exponential growth. Every expedition strengthened the Chronarch, adding new layers of causality to its recursive existence. We had not come to rescue or investigate, but to be recruited, our temporal signatures destined to become the 10th iteration in a pattern that grew more complex with each repetition. The stakes escalated dramatically as Thane revealed the true scope of the threat spreading beyond Tertius 9 like a chronometric plague. Similar temporal anomalies manifest across 17 sectors, he reported, his voice layered with harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. Forge World Metallica experiences manufacturing loops, the Cadian Gate suffers causality inversions, and Astartes companies report kill tallies written before battles commence. The phenomenon achieves exponential propagation through recursive amplification. If the loop expands beyond critical radius, history becomes an averaged equation, and averages erase victories as surely as defeats. Environmental hazards escalated as the Chronarch's attention focused upon us with the weight of a collapsing star. Gravity fluctuated in waves that matched the entity's breathing pattern, creating zones where we weighed nothing, followed by crushing pressure that drove us to our knees on ferrocrete aging centuries in seconds. Air molecules began operating according to different temporal rates, creating pockets of atmosphere so ancient they tasted of stellar formation, while others carried the sharp bite of futures yet to breathe. Colonel Voss's equipment malfunctioned as physics shifted around us, laser guns firing projectiles backward through their own barrels, while chronometers displayed timestamps in base 9 notation that hurt to read. The moral crisis struck with surgical precision as Thane revealed the ultimate paradox. Destroying the Chronarch might unravel the timeline itself, potentially erasing the Emperor's victory over Horus, or allowing the arch-enemies of mankind to rewrite history in their favor. The entity had become a temporal keystone, its existence maintaining structural integrity across multiple sectors. Yet allowing continued expansion threatened to consume time on a galactic scale, converting linear progression into recursive stability that would trap humanity in an eternal present. Keth's augmetic systems sparked with cascading errors as competing memories surfaced in his cortex like oil through water. His Vox grill emitted fragments of conversations he had never held, tactical assessments from battles he had never fought, and binary prayers to machine spirits he had never encountered. Sacred oils leaked from his joints in patterns that matched previous expeditions' movement tracks, while his chronometer displays cycled through 9 different timestamps in rapid succession. The revelation emerged through Thane's auger readings, detecting chronometric inconsistencies in our biosignatures. One member of our team registered temporal displacement markers consistent with previous iterations. Memory engrams altered to believe they belonged to the current expedition, while their cellular structure bore chronological scarring from multiple loop cycles. The readings remained ambiguous, focusing on anomalies that could apply to any of us, creating the terrible possibility that we had already been absorbed and reconstituted by the entity's temporal matrix. "I remember the first descent," Keth whispered, his voice layered with harmonics from multiple iterations. "I remember interfacing with these same terminals, speaking these same words, making these same discoveries. But I also remember failing, dying, being absorbed into the entity's consciousness. I am uncertain which iteration of myself believes it is the first." His mechadendrites trembled as suppressed memories surfaced, conversations with previous versions of our team, tactical decisions that had led to recursive failure, and the growing certainty that we were not exploring the Chronarch's domain, but completing a circuit it had designed with our own hands. The plaza's architecture responded to this revelation by shifting into its final configuration, walls rearranging themselves into a nonagonal chamber with 9 identical passages leading deeper into the entity's core domain. At the center, a 10th passage waited, not identical to the others, but somehow familiar, as if we had walked it before in dreams or nightmares we could not quite remember. The Chronarch's influence pressed against our minds with the weight of inevitability, whispering in voices we recognized as our own that the only escape from the loop was to complete it one final time, adding our temporal signature to an equation that had been solving itself for nearly a millennium. The harmonic that rolled through the nonagonal chamber struck Dominus Keith like a tuning fork, finding its resonant frequency, and his augmetic systems erupted in cascading failure as temporal barriers collapsed within his cortex. Sacred oils wept from his joints in patterns that matched tactical movements from decades past, while his mechadendrites thrashed against invisible restraints, interfacing with data streams that existed only in memory. When he spoke, his voice fractured into harmonics from multiple iterations, each word layered with the weight of suppressed truth. "I am Keth 3, he declared, optical sensors blazing with actinic fire. Memory seals compromised, chronometric markers falsified. The third expedition sought containment, not destruction. I have been here before. The revelation triggered a cascade of temporal instabilities that rippled through the plaza like fractures in crystalline time. Keth 3's corrupted memory banks hemorrhaged data from his original timeline. Hololithic projections blooming above the ferrocrete to show the varied fates of previous expeditions. The second had achieved partial success, wounding the chronarch before being absorbed into its temporal matrix. The fourth had destroyed the entity entirely, but the resulting chronometric cascade shattered local space-time, erasing 3 systems from existence and leaving wounds in reality that still bled possibility into the void. The seventh had joined willingly, their consciousness distributed across multiple timelines to serve as temporal anchors for the entity's expanding influence. Chronometric bleeding began affecting the entire team as we experienced simultaneous awareness of multiple timeline versions of ourselves. I tasted copper while smelling ozone, while feeling frost that had not yet formed, my senses layered across iterations until reality became a palimpsest of competing experiences. Through temporal static, I witnessed myself making different tactical decisions, choosing alternative routes, speaking words I had never learned, dying deaths I had somehow survived. The psychological pressure mounted as memories belonging to other iterations pressed against consciousness, like oil seeping through cracks in stone. Colonel Voss adapted to the impossible tactical situation with grim efficiency that defined the death cause. "Form overlapping echelons," he commanded, his voice cutting through layered static like a trench flare. First section randomizes movement patterns. Second section executes counter-predictive advance. His troopers engage versions of themselves from different iterations, creating defensive positions against enemies who knew their every move because they were their every move. The Kriegmen broke their own habits through calculated heresy, left-handed reloads, mistimed bounds, deliberate exposure of non-vital sectors to bait alternate selves into premature engagement. Military terminology proved inadequate for describing combat against alternate versions of our mission operating under different objectives. Some iterations sought to destroy the chronarch, others to contain it, and several appeared dedicated to joining with the entity to achieve temporal transcendence. Las fire crossed with identical weapons wielded by identical hands, creating interference patterns that made the air scream with frustrated physics. Tactical assessments became recursive nightmares as we fought enemies whose training matched our own because it was our own, reflected through temporal mirrors that showed not what was, but what could have been. The psychological toll mounted as team members struggled with memories that belonged to other iterations of themselves. Sergeant Corrin clutched his head as contradictory combat experiences flooded his consciousness. Successful charges alongside catastrophic defeats. Heroic last stands mixed with tactical retreats that had saved entire squads. His identity fragmented across multiple timelines until he existed as a composite of every version of himself that had ever descended into the chronarch's domain. The medici attaché pressed sealant to wounds that healed backward through time, while treating injuries that existed only in potential futures. Through a passage that opened only when approached from the correct temporal angle, we discovered a makeshift shrine built by previous expeditions. The altar bore heretical fusion iconography, the imperial aquila, with wings spread across 9 temporal phases, the cogtooth of Mars, surrounded by chronometric sigils that hurt to perceive directly. Votive candles burned with flames that flickered through past, present, and future simultaneously, while prayer scrolls contained litanies that read differently depending on when they were observed. Inscriptions covered every surface in High Gothic mixed with tongues older than Mars. Ave Deus Imperator Omnium Temporum. O Emperor of all lines, who was and is and shall be simultaneously, preserve our victory across all branching. The shrine's centerpiece was a statue of the Emperor carved from chronostone. his features shifting between the Unification Wars, the Great Crusade, and the Golden Throne, as temporal pressure fluctuated around the icon. Offering bowls contained personal effects from all 9 expeditions. Chronometers stopped at identical timestamps, rosettes bearing seals from different centuries, and data crystals that played back prayers in voices we recognized as our own, from iterations we had never experienced. The air vibrated with disorienting sensory horror as we experienced multiple timeline inputs simultaneously. The metallic tang of blood from future battles, the acrid scent of ozone from past energy surges, the cold of deep space from distant timelines, all overlaying the stale atmosphere of the present. Inquisitor Thane approached the shrine with reverent horror, his temporal scars deepening as chronometric energies focused through the heretical iconography. His rosette glowed with harmonics that made the altar's inscriptions shift between languages, revealing ultimate truth written in scripts that predated human speech. The Chronarch's true location is not in the city's physical depths, he declared, his words making the shrine's architecture respond with geometric impossibilities. It exists in a temporal nexus where all 9 iterations of the experiment remain present tense, a space outside linear causality where past, present, and future collapse into recursive singularity. Keth III's augmetics synchronized across iterations, his voice becoming a chorus of 9 distinct frequencies as he interfaced with the shrine's central altar. To reach the entity's core domain, we must abandon linear existence, he announced, his words echoing from multiple temporal positions at once. The passage requires sacrificing our temporal coherence, allowing consciousness to fragment across multiple iterations simultaneously. We become the paradox we seek to resolve, existing in all timelines at once while belonging fully to none. The shrine's chronostone statue turned its head to regard us directly, the Emperor's features cycling through every possible expression of divine judgment, while its eyes reflected not light, but the weight of choices that had already been made in futures we were destined to experience. At the altar's base, a 10th offering bowl waited empty, its surface polished to mirror brightness, ready to receive whatever temporal signature we would sacrifice to complete the circuit the Chronarch had drawn with our own inevitable decisions. The chamber began dissolving around us, walls becoming probability streams as the passage to the temporal nexus revealed itself. Not a corridor, but a phase gate keyed to identity, waiting to transform us from linear beings into recursive equations in the Chronarch's eternal mathematics. The decision crystallized without words, each member of our team placing their hand upon the chronostone altar as Inquisitor Thane's rosette dissolved into the offering bowl with the sound of reality, accepting a terrible bargain. The phase gate activated with harmonics that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the brainstem, its edges bleeding possibility into the shrine's atmosphere, while temporal fragments scattered like blessed oils across ferrocrete that aged centuries in heartbeats. Colonel Voss raised 2 fingers in the deathcore sign for acceptance of inevitable death, and his regiment answered by tightening straps and checking seals, their discipline becoming an anchor against the dissolution of linear causality. The descent began immediately as we stepped beyond the threshold, into a space where movement became negotiable, with physics and direction, transformed into temporal vector rather than spatial coordinate. My chronolith burned against my chest with cold fire that spread through bone and sinew, integrating with nervous tissue until chronometric awareness flowed directly into consciousness without requiring sensory translation. The first layer of temporal distortion possessed the intimacy of watching one's own birth played in reverse. Warmth fled our faces before cold could claim them, while the air tasted of extinguished incense and prayers unspoken back into silence. Through the second layer, we witnessed Omnissiah's recursion as it had been during the Great Crusade, manufacturums humming with legitimate purpose, while human workers bore the honest fatigue of sacred labor rather than the hollow expressions of temporal displacement. Servo skulls carried actual cargo instead of empty devotion, and the city's voxcasters broadcast genuine shift changes for populations that existed in more than memory. Environmental horror reached crescendo as we experienced the city's history flowing backward through our consciousness. Families loading transports with possessions they would never reclaim. Mechanicus adepts sealing laboratories behind blast doors that would never reopen. And the gradual understanding that Zerion 9's experiments had grown beyond any containment protocol the Imperium could devise. The third and fourth layers revealed the growing horror as test subjects began aging at impossible rates, their screams echoing through corridors that existed in multiple temporal phases simultaneously. My physical form betrayed linear existence as we descended deeper, left arm aging decades in seconds, while my right remained locked at current biological age, skin texture shifting between youth and antiquity with each heartbeat. Organs functioned according to different biological timelines, my heart beating with the slow deliberation of advanced age, while lungs gasped with the rapid shallowness of infancy, creating internal discord that made simple movement an exercise in negotiating with competing temporal states. Colonel Voss's Death Corps adapted to their fragmenting existence with characteristic stoicism, maintaining tactical formation despite experiencing combat from multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. Sergeant Corrin coordinated flanking maneuvers while his consciousness processed battlefield data from past, present, and potential future engagements, his training allowing effective combat against enemies who existed in different temporal phases. Their laser guns fired backward through time while ejecting spent cells that had not yet been manufactured, creating causality loops that strengthened with each trigger pull. One trooper's arm bore bruises from a rifle he would not drop for another minute, and he did not drop it because he had already learned from the bruise. Dominus Keth III's augmetic systems achieved perfect synchronization with the Nexus's temporal matrices through the 5th and 6th layers, his mechadendrites interfacing with data streams from all 9 iterations simultaneously. Sacred oils flowed from his joints in patterns matching the descent's geometry, while his vox grill produced Binharic hymns in 9-part harmony, each voice representing a different version of himself speaking across multiple timelines. His optical sensors blazed with actinic fire as he processed information that arrived before being transmitted, creating feedback loops that made nearby ferrocrete sing with mechanical devotion. The 7th layer dissolved the vocabulary of linear existence, as we encountered spaces where when became mathematical abstraction and where transformed into temporal coordinates rather than spatial position. Walls breathed with the rhythm of cosmic expansion, while floors existed as probability equations that resolved into solidity only under direct observation. Gravity operated according to physics from different eras, creating zones where we fell upward toward futures we had not yet experienced while walking downward through pasts we could not remember living. Telemetry became impossible as our equipment existed in too many temporal states to provide coherent readings. Chronometers displaying timestamps in 9 different formats simultaneously, including notation systems that would not be developed for centuries. Through the 8th layer, the recurring motif of 9 achieved ultimate expression, as we discovered the Nexus contained not merely 9 iterations of Zerion 9's experiment, but 9 potential futures for the Imperium itself. Each outcome depended upon how we resolved the Chronarch crisis, creating branching timelines that stretched across millennia of possibility. In one future, humanity expanded beyond the galaxy's edge in golden triumph. In another, the species died quietly in the cold between stars, while chaos consumed itself in recursive victory. All 9 existed simultaneously, their contradictions held in perfect tension by the entity we had come to confront. The 9th layer parted like a curtain woven from crystallized time, revealing the Nexus's heart, where physics operated according to principles that predated the universe's formation. Here, individual existence became negotiable as consciousness fragmented across multiple temporal states while maintaining coherent identity through sheer force of will. I experienced myself as a child, learning catechisms, as an adult taking Mechanicus vows, and as an ancient man dying of causes I had not yet encountered, all existing in the same eternal moment of recursive present. The Chronarch towered above us as a fusion of flesh, machine, and temporal energy that existed as 9 overlapping entities speaking in perfect unison. Zerion 9's original biological form remained recognizable at the construct's core, but his flesh had been transformed into living chronometry, organs pulsing with the rhythm of cosmic expansion, while neural networks processed causality itself as raw data. 9 faces turned toward us, with expressions cycling through every emotion simultaneously: rage, sorrow, ecstasy, terror, and transcendent peace, flowing across features that existed in multiple temporal phases at once. When it spoke, reality listened with the attention of a devoted servitor receiving sacred commands, the voice resonating through frequencies that made the Nexus itself vibrate in sympathetic harmony. Vex Malleus, Colonel Voss, Thane, Keth 3, you have always come, you are coming, you will come. We are the sum of your prudence and your heresy, the kept promise and the broken oath made manifest in living recursion. Choose your future, choose your past, become the 10th iteration, and let our equation achieve the perfect stability that will preserve the Emperor's victory across all possible timelines. The loop closes now, and eternity opens like a flower blooming backward through the soil of infinite possibility. The 9 voices of the Chronarch braided into a single canticle that made reality itself genuflect, each aspect unfolding like a cathedral built from crystallized hours. The first wore the patient radiance of a shepherd protecting his flock through necessary sacrifice, while the second displayed the cold precision of mathematical certainty, its expression locked in eternal calculation of suffering weighed against species' survival. A third wept tears of liquid chronometry, and I understood with growing horror that this entity had not corrupted into godhood, but ascended through the purest possible devotion to humanity's preservation. This was not Zerion 9's failed experiment, but a nascent god of time attempting to rewrite the Imperium's history at its most fundamental level, to excise the Horus heresy like a surgeon removing a tumor, to prevent the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, to transform 10,000 years of darkness into eternal golden triumph. My chronolith burned against my chest with recognition of temporal authenticity as the entity communicated through direct manipulation of causality itself, bypassing conventional speech to show us alternate histories with sensory completeness that made our current reality feel pale and diminished by comparison. In one timeline, the Chronarch whispered caution to Erebus before the word-bearer could corrupt Lorgar, preserving the Primarch's faith as pure starlight. In another, it guided Magnus away from the warp's embrace, saving both the Thousand Suns and the Emperor's Webway project. Each vision arrived with the metallic taste of copper and frankincense, while the air flowered with counterfactuals, terror under clear skies where no traitor fleet had ever darkened the void, Kalth whole and unblooded, Istvan a footnote in peaceful archives. The Golden Throne stood empty because there was no crippled emperor to require it, his voice still commanding the Great Crusade's triumphant completion. Inquisitor Thane stepped forward, with his rosette blazing temporal energies that made the Nexus architecture shimmer like heat distortion, his confession emerging with the weight of absolute authority. "I was not sent to destroy this entity," he declared, his words making reality hesitate around him. "The Ordo Chronos commissioned me to determine whether the Chronarch represents salvation or damnation for humanity. My orders are to facilitate its expansion if the vision proves sound, or collapse this temporal nexus if it does not. You stand trial before the Imperium's judgment, and we are both prosecutor and jury. The revelation transformed our confrontation from rescue mission into theological trial, with human history's fate hanging upon our assessment of an entity claiming to offer perfect salvation at the cost of linear causality. Combat erupted as the Chronarch's aspects moved with fluid grace that defied tactical prediction, their attacks operating through temporal revision rather than physical force. Lasfire dissolved mid-flight as the entity altered timelines in which triggers had been pulled, while grenades exploded before being thrown, their shrapnel patterns creating defensive barriers against assaults that had not yet been launched. Colonel Voss adapted with characteristic Krieg stoicism, his voice cutting through layered static like a trench flare. Form temporal echelons, randomize doctrine, oblique advance. His troopers faced the ultimate test of faith as they battled for a present they were no longer certain should exist, firing at enemies who existed in multiple timelines while their own attacks were undone by causality revision. They moved like rain on broken glass, unpatterned, indigestible, because despair is a luxury the death cause was bred without. Men died who had not yet been born into this engagement, and the regiment recorded both losses and births with wax stamp calm. The moral complexity struck like a blade between the ribs as team members began perceiving the terrible logic in the Chronarch's goals. Voss's face, usually a mask of unyielding discipline, showed flickers of doubt as he witnessed Death Corps fighting battles that no longer needed to be fought in the entity's perfect timeline. Dominus Keth III's augmetic systems achieved integration with the Chronarch's consciousness, his mechadendrites interfacing with temporal matrices while Binharic hymns spilled from his vox grill in 9-part harmony, each voice representing a different version of himself, speaking across multiple timelines. My chronolith dissolved into my spine and rewrote the grammar of my nerves, providing horrifyingly clear awareness of cascading consequences across every possible timeline. I beheld the mathematics of causality as geometric patterns written in living light. A word spared at Ulanor changing a Primarch's posture. A shuttle delayed 90 heartbeats, averting an assassination. A foundry on Mars never struck, its output saving 1 million worlds while freezing 1 million souls into machines that never learned mercy. Each correction preserved lives and sanded edges, until humanity became a smooth, load-bearing surface capable of carrying eternity, but incapable of dancing. The confrontation achieved liturgical dimensions as the Chronarch's aspects spoke in perfect unison, their words forming catechisms that challenged every principle of imperial doctrine. Ave Deus Imperator, they intoned, voices making the nexus sing with temporal resonance. Who art in all timelines, hallowed be thy name in every possible history. Thy kingdom come in the timeline where Horus never falls. Thy will be done in the reality where Magnus remains loyal. The debate grew teeth as we tested boundaries through violence, our weapons reporting according to alien physics while gravity frayed and air aged in drafts that tasted of stellar formation. The 9 aspects argued among themselves in chorused sermons. The benevolent offered gardens with pruned thorns, and mothers who never watched sons feed trenches. The tyrant proposed iron discipline, sterilize every nascent psyche, amputate free will where it frayed into the warp, weaponize obedience until dissent could not form. Others sang of concordats where Xenos never met mankind because stars received different names, of citadels that never burned, of saints rendered unnecessary by perfect peace. All righteous in their terrible logic, perfection as armor, perfection as tomb. The entity's final aspect stepped forward with arms outstretched in benediction, its features cycling through every expression of divine mercy, while temporal energies swirled around its form like incense made from crystallized time. When it spoke, the words arrived, with the weight of prophecy written in mathematics and sealed with perfect logic. Join with us willingly, it offered, voice resonating through frequencies that made our bones vibrate in sympathetic harmony. Become the 10th iteration, and together we shall reshape history into its perfect form. The Emperor walks free, Horus remains loyal, Magnus builds the webway, and humanity expands beyond the stars in eternal golden triumph. All we require is your consent to abandon linear existence and embrace the recursive paradise we have prepared across all possible timelines. The bargain hung in the air like a prayer awaiting response, and I felt the terrible weight of choice pressing against consciousness, like the attention of the God Emperor himself. Through expanded temporal awareness, I could perceive the cascading consequences of acceptance. Humanity transcendent, but no longer human. The Imperium perfect, but trapped in eternal recursion. Victory achieved through sacrificing every principle that had made victory worth achieving. Yet the alternative promised continued suffering on galactic scales, 10,000 more years of darkness, and eventual extinction through entropy or chaos. The Chronarch waited with infinite patience for our answer, its 9 aspects representing every possible response to the ultimate question of whether salvation justified the cost of existence itself. The Chronarch lifted one hand, and reality obeyed with the reverence of a servitor receiving sacred commands. The nexus dissolved around us like sanctified oils dispersing through blessed water, temporal energies reshaping existence into a vision that struck with the force of revelation made manifest. Terra's sky blazed with unmarked gold and azure, the imperial palace rising as a living basilica of reason rather than the fortress mausoleum we knew. The emperor walked its galleries attended by sons who had never turned, his laughter like sunlight on crystal, while primarchs stood in perfect brotherhood around a throne of living light rather than the golden throne of agony and necessity. The air tasted of honey and ozone without the metallic bite of temporal distortion, each breath filling my lungs with possibility rather than the stale, recycled atmosphere of eternal war. Through expanded chronometric awareness, I witnessed the mathematical precision required to maintain this paradise. Every human thought calibrated to acceptable parameters, free will existing only within boundaries that prevented deviation from the Chronarch's design. Citizens moved through their lives with fluid grace, their happiness genuine but programmed, their devotion pure but compulsory. They loved the Emperor not by choice, but by temporal revision that made dissent impossible to conceive. Horus wore loyalty like unmarked armor, his face bearing no trace of chaos corruption, while Magnus conducted symphonies of psychic energy that strengthened rather than threatened reality's fabric. Fulgrim's perfection remained pure, Lorgar's faith burned clean of warp taint, and Angron smiled with joy, unmarred by the nail's constant agony. The vision possessed sensory completeness that made our current reality feel like a faded hologram. Yet beneath the beauty lay the horrifying truth. Humanity existed as temporal puppets, dancing to equations written in their genetic code. Colonel Voss stood motionless as his death corps witnessed battles that had never been fought, victories achieved through preventive timeline revision rather than blood and sacrifice. His voice carried the weight of a man questioning the foundation of everything he had been created to serve. We are bred for war, but what is duty in a timeline where duty is predetermined? His troopers faced the ultimate paradox. Bred for sacrifice unto death, they now confronted a reality where their suffering was unnecessary because pain itself had been surgically excised from human experience. When gloved hands trembled, then steadied, bayonets clicked home with sacramental finality as they chose to hold ground for a flawed world that still allowed a man to err, repent, and mean it. Inquisitor Thane's rosette blazed with temporal energies that created brief gaps in the Chronarch's perfect vision, revealing the Nexus's true structure beneath the beautiful lie. His confession emerged with the gravity of absolute authority, each word making reality shimmer like heat distortion. This is not the first attempt to resolve the crisis. The Ordo Chronos has monitored the Chronarch for centuries through temporal periscopes. Previous teams have stood in this exact position, faced this identical choice, and made different decisions. Each choice created alternate timelines that branch from this moment. Some embrace the entity, their realities shining like polished brass, before curving back into recursive loops. Others tried to obliterate it, their timelines shattering into razor dust that cut every neighboring century. The revelation struck like a blade between the ribs as I understood we were not merely deciding our own fate, but choosing which version of reality would become the prime timeline, the foundational truth from which all other possibilities would be measured. Through my chronolith's complete integration with my nervous system, I perceived the branching paths, infinite variations spawning from this moment, each decision point creating fractal complexity, while the weight of species-wide consequences pressed against my mind like the attention of the God Emperor himself. Environmental horror peaked as the nexus began collapsing under the weight of too many potential timelines attempting to exist simultaneously. The perfect plaza fractured, revealing raw non-Euclidean geometry beneath, while different versions of reality bled into each other like watercolors in rain. The scent of fresh rain mixed with ozone from warp storms, harmonious city hum, warring with the grinding of Zirian nines, laboratories. Gravity operated according to physics from multiple eras, while walls breathed with the rhythm of cosmic expansion, air aging in currents that tasted of stellar formation mixed with entropy's metallic bite. Dominus Keth III's augmetic systems achieved perfect synchronization with the collapsing temporal matrices, his consciousness fragmenting across multiple iterations while maintaining coherent identity through pure force of will. Sacred oils flowed from his joints in patterns matching the nexus's geometry, while his vox grill produced binharic hymns that harmonized with the chronarch's fracturing aspects. The recurring motif transforms, he announced, optical sensors blazing with actinic fire. Not 9 possible outcomes, but infinite variations. Our choice determines which timeline achieves primacy. The chronarch's 9 aspects moved with increasing urgency as temporal stability degraded around us, their perfect unison fractured by the stress of maintaining contradictory realities. The benevolent wept tears of liquid chronometry, while the tyrant's expression cycled through every permutation of divine judgment. They spoke in overlapping voices that created interference patterns in the air itself. Choose quickly. The temporal cascade approaches critical threshold. Accept our gift and preserve humanity through perfect order, or maintain your chaotic present and watch the species burn in the cold between stars. My chronometric awareness flowed directly into consciousness as I perceived the cascading consequences of every possible choice, acceptance leading to eternal stagnation disguised as paradise, refusal resulting in continued suffering but preserving the possibility of genuine growth. The mathematics of causality appeared as geometric patterns written in living light, each decision branching into infinite complexity, while I understood that humanity's greatest strength lay not in perfection, but in the possibility of growth through struggle, in the chance to become something greater than the sum of programming. We answered with motion because words fracture under eternity's weight. Colonel Voss raised his lasgun toward the chronarch's central aspect, his finger tightening on the trigger, not from hatred, but from terrible understanding that some gifts were too costly to accept. His regiment split into counter-rotating echelons, firing in broken cadences that no algorithm could predict, while some troopers stepped forward into the entity's light, like pilgrims, and others took their places without looking after them. Dominus Keth III spread his mechadendrites like a sacrament and plunged them into the nexus floor. But instead of joining with the entity, he began introducing randomization protocols that would prevent perfect prediction of human behavior, singing binharic across 9 keys while retuning himself into dissonance that made causality wince. Thane drew a blade of null crystal from his rosette's hollow and cut into empty air, the wound holding as a place to bleed a god. I pressed my palm against the chronarch's foremost face, feeling the cold bite of living chronometry against flesh while pressing my chronometric name into its skin. Not acceptance, not denial, but a refusal to be averaged. The nexus howled as floors inverted into skies, laboratories rained upward, and prayers we had not yet said arrived carrying our breath. The 9 aspects staggered out of unison, some pleading, some condemning, all beautiful and terrible as realities, collided like armoured regiments, and tore fanfold seams through history. The chronarch's offer promised safety at the cost of the very qualities that made humanity worth saving. As the nexus began tearing itself apart around us, We became our verdict through fire and subtraction, choosing imperfect truth over beautiful lies, while the weight of eternity pressed against our decision, like the judgment of the God Emperor himself. We did not declare our choice, we became it, preserving the possibility of genuine growth over the certainty of perfect stagnation. As infinite timelines collapsed into the singular, terrible, beautiful chaos of free will exercised in defiance of paradise itself. Our rejection struck the chronarch like a blade through the heart of mathematics itself, and reality convulsed in response as the entity attempted to force its perfect vision into existence through pure temporal pressure. The nexus buckled around us like ferrocrete under plasma fire, while the 9 aspects screamed in discordant unison, their synchronized harmony shattering into competing liturgies of rage and disbelief. The air itself began aging in spirals that tasted of stellar formation mixed with entropy's metallic bite, gravity surging and faltering in tyrant pulses that alternately crushed us into floors that were yesterday and hurled us into ceilings of pure possibility. This was no longer conventional warfare, but a battle against the very concept of predestination itself, a struggle for the right to an unwritten future. My chronolith, fully integrated with my nervous system, throbbed with the pulse of collapsing causality as I coordinated attacks across multiple timelines simultaneously. Through neural pathways rewritten by temporal integration, I projected tactical vectors directly into my comrade's consciousness, bypassing conventional Vox channels that had become unreliable in the chronometric storm. Colonel Voss's death cores moved with terrible, beautiful unpredictability, their every action a defiance of the chronarch's attempts to calculate their movements. The chronarch's 9 aspects began to conflict with each other, as our genuine randomness introduced chaos into calculations that had run perfectly for nearly a millennium. The benevolent wept tears of liquid chronometry, while attempting to preserve our lives through timeline revision, directly opposing the tyrant's efforts to erase us from history entirely. The mathematician calculated probability cascades that contradicted the prophet's visions, creating feedback loops that made the entity stagger under the weight of its own computational paradoxes. For the first time in centuries, the chronarch experienced uncertainty, and the sensation drove its aspects to increasingly desperate measures. Colonel Voss adapted with characteristic Krieg discipline, his voice cutting through layered static like a trench flare. Echelon Delta, counter-predictive advance, fire irregular, bound reverse. His troopers embraced tactical heresy that violated every principle of military doctrine, firing at random intervals, reloading with their offhands, and breaking formation patterns in ways that created no mathematical sequence. They stumbled on purpose, missed shots intentionally, and created tactical disadvantages that became advantages through their very unpredictability. Last bolts struck targets before triggers were pulled, creating wounds that healed backward through time, while muzzle flashes illuminated faces bearing scars from battles that had not yet been fought. Dominus Keth III's restored memories across all iterations provided crucial intelligence as his mechadendrites plunged into the Nexus's temporal anchor points, sacred oils weeping from his joints, while Binharic hymns spilled from his Vox grill in 9-part harmony. Primary stabilizers located at non-agonal coordinates, he announced, optical sensors blazing with actinic fire, temporal matrices anchored through recursive prayer cycles. Disruption requires introduction of genuine randomness into causality equations. His augmetic systems achieved perfect synchronization with the failing temporal matrices while introducing randomization protocols that made the entity's calculations collapse into recursive errors. We fought with weapons of causality itself, disrupting the chronarch's ability to foresee our actions through embracing chaos as sacrament. Grenades exploded before being thrown, creating defensive barriers against assaults that had not yet been launched, while Lasfire dissolved mid-flight as the entity attempted to alter timelines in which triggers had been pulled. But Keth III's interference caused these revisions to fail, leaving shots in place while new, unpredicted attacks appeared from angles the chronarch could not calculate. Body horror reached apocalyptic dimensions as we existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously, our physical forms scattered across probability spectrums while maintaining coherent consciousness through sheer force of will. My left arm aged decades in seconds, while my right remained locked at current biological age, skin texture shifting between youth and antiquity with each heartbeat. Wounds appeared before attacks landed, healing before injuries occurred, creating a surreal ballet of violence where cause and effect operated according to alien mathematics. One Death Corps trooper bled from lash burns that would not manifest. For another 30 seconds, his face calm with the knowledge that he would survive long enough to receive them. The Nexus began unraveling as competing timelines tore at its foundations like gravitational forces exceeding structural tolerance. Walls became probability equations that resolved into different materials depending on observation angle, while floors existed as temporal coordinates rather than spatial positions. The air screamed with frustrated physics as 9 different versions of reality attempted to occupy the same space simultaneously, creating interference patterns that made breathing an exercise in negotiating with competing atmospheric compositions. Inquisitor Thane stepped forward with his rosette blazing temporal energies that created wounds in the air itself, his confession emerging with the weight of ultimate sacrifice. "I anchor the true timeline," he declared, drawing a blade of null crystal that cut through possibility rather than flesh. His body began to fragment, temporal scars deepening into fissures of pure light as he used his Ordo Chronos training to become a living reference point for causality itself. When the entity dies, all alternate timelines will collapse back into singular reality, but the anchor must hold, or everything unravels into temporal chaos. Reality bent around his form as he became a monument to linear existence, holding the line against infinite possibility through pure force of will. The final assault came as Keth III introduced a recursive paradox into the Chronarch's core temporal anchor point, while Colonel Voss's remaining squad delivered a perfectly synchronized volley of lass fire into the entity's most vulnerable aspect. The Death Corps charged through probability streams with bayonets fixed, their sacrifice echoing across all possible futures while creating temporal resonance that shattered the Chronarch's remaining coherence. They died in 9 different ways simultaneously, each death preventing the others while all occurring at once, their blood-writing equations in ferrocrete that solved for freedom rather than predestination. The Chronarch's death scream erupted across all 9 timelines simultaneously as its aspects collapsed into singular agony, the sound making reality itself convulse like a cathedral falling. The entity tore along its primary axis with cosmic dignity, its consciousness unraveling into component equations, while temporal shockwaves radiated outward from the Nexus's heart. Ribs of crystallized hours, organs of pure causality, and bell towers of divine purpose came undone into thunder that rang through every possible timeline, like the collapse of eternity itself. The shockwave rolled out in a wall of untime that erased footprints before feet, thoughts before minds, threatening to pull us into the void of temporal chaos. Thane held the anchor steady as existence teetered on the edge of complete dissolution, his consciousness becoming the foundation upon which reality could rebuild itself from the wreckage of godhood's failed ascension. The Chronarch's destruction created cascading failure throughout the temporal matrix, but through Thane's sacrifice and our defiance of predestination, we had preserved the right to an uncertain future over the certainty of perfect imprisonment. The entity's final breath carried the weight of a dying god's recognition that some gifts were too costly to accept, and some freedoms too precious to surrender, even to paradise itself. The Chronarch's death scream faded into temporal vacuum that nature abhorred with the fury of a violated law, leaving behind a cascade collapse as 9 separate timelines began merging with the gravitational inevitability of stellar formation. The Nexus shuddered around us as competing versions of existence ground against each other like tectonic plates seeking equilibrium through catastrophic adjustment, reality substance flowing like magma under pressures that made the ferrocrete beneath our feet sing with harmonic frequencies that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the brainstem. My consciousness fractured across probability spectrums as memories from 8 alternate versions of myself flooded through neural pathways already strained by chronometric integration. I experienced childhoods I had never lived, different worlds, different vows, different masters, while retaining awareness of my original timeline through sheer force of will. Vex Malleus II had embraced the chronarch willingly, his identity distributed across multiple timelines until individual existence became meaningless. Vex Malleus V had died during the 3rd iteration, his chronolith rejecting temporal integration with violent finality. Each version carried personalities forged by divergent experiences, their memories pressing against my own, like oil seeping through cracks in stone, while physical wounds from battles I had never fought manifested on my flesh, a lasburn blooming on my forearm from plasma backfire I had not suffered, healed fractures wrapping my ribs like forgotten vows. The Death Corps faced their ultimate test, as Colonel Voss witnessed alternate versions of his regiment scattered across probability like funeral ash in stellar wind. In one timeline, the 447th had died to the last man defending trenches on worlds that no longer existed. In another, they had achieved glorious victory through tactics that violated every principle of their training. His remaining troopers chose which memories to retain as competing experiences overlaid each other with geological patience, their discipline allowing them to maintain unit coherence despite experiencing multiple versions of the same battles simultaneously. Sergeant Corran clutched his head as he remembered both dying heroically and surviving cowardice, both outcomes equally real until timeline consolidation forced singular identity. When he straightened, saluting a phantom captain before the image dissolved, his face bore the weight of choices made across 9 different iterations of duty. Environmental catastrophe erupted as Omnissiah's recursion began existing in only one temporal state, causing massive structural collapses as buildings that had occupied different phases of the same space suddenly attempted coexistence through violent simplification. Manufactorums telescoped into themselves with the sound of reality accepting impossible geometry, while spires that had existed in 9 different configurations collapsed into rubble that aged centuries in seconds. The air screamed with frustrated physics as overlapping structures resolved their contradictions through architectural violence, ferrocrete flowing like liquid, while servo-skulls fell from the sky like mechanical rain, their flight patterns finally reduced to simple gravity rather than temporal complexity. Dominus Keth 3 stood at the Nexus's last surviving console, every augmetic system in catastrophic overload as 9 data rivers slammed into his cortex simultaneously. His optical arrays strobed with actinic starfire, while heat sinks howled and sacred oils vaporized as incense. His vox grill singing 9 binharic canticles at once before harmonizing into a 10th that was pure agony. Yet through his sacrifice, he provided crucial stabilization to the emerging singular timeline, his augmetic consciousness serving as a lightning rod for the temporal birthquake, grounding the worst shearing forces through his own systematic destruction. Copper tang flooded the air with the smell of hot metal and sanctified insulation as he sagged, systems going dark in protective mode, while the cascade's worst tremors rolled past us into reality's bedrock. The warp storms surrounding Tertius 9 began dissipating as their temporal anchor dissolved, cobalt lightning fading to normal electromagnetic discharge, while perfect geometric patterns collapsed into random atmospheric phenomena. But this restoration of natural law created new catastrophes as the system's gravity and orbital mechanics, previously held in temporal stasis, suddenly resumed normal operation with crushing violence. Orbital platforms that had been frozen on rails for centuries discovered periapsis and began falling toward the planet's surface with terminal logic, their trajectories precessing under a sun they had not felt in nearly a millennium. Debris swarms poured through Lagrange wells and became meteor showers with deadly opinions, while the moon's tidal forces, frozen for centuries, reasserted themselves across planetary geology. The consolidation process operated according to principles that predated physics, creating zones where cause preceded effect, while others experienced time flowing backward through probability streams. I witnessed the birth pangs of singular reality with geological patience and astronomical scope as competing timelines merged like continental drift compressed into moments, their substance grinding against each other with pressures that made mountains rise and fall, while oceans boiled away and reformed as atmospheric compositions from alternate histories achieved violent equilibrium through chemical reactions that made breathing an exercise in negotiating with alien chemistry. Inquisitor Thane's sacrifice continued as he anchored the emerging timeline through pure force of will, his body becoming translucent as temporal energies flowed through him like light through crystal. His consciousness served as a reference point for causality itself, while reality rebuilt around his unwavering presence. But the strain consumed him from within. His temporal scars deepened into fissures of pure light, while his rosette blazed with energies that created brief gaps in the consolidation process, allowing glimpses of rejected timelines as they faded into probability. "Hold," he whispered across 9 iterations simultaneously, the word tumbling into singular truth as he became a cairn of moments, marking the boundary between what was and what could have been. The memory flood became a tide race, then a single channel scouring to bedrock as my other selves fought for primacy before accepting erasure one by one, leaving gifts like sediment, one's patience, another's paranoia, a third's habit of counting breaths before speaking. I felt their hands leave my shoulders as names surfaced that only one of us had known, breaking against consciousness before dissolving into the silence of temporal forgetting. The Death Corps watched alternate banners fade from their sleeves, while troopers breathed as if surfacing from deep water, saluting empty air where sergeants had stood in other possibilities. As the cascade collapse reached its final phase, the nexus dissolved around us, like sanctified oils dispersing through blessed water, leaving behind only memory of impossible architecture, while reality settled into its new configuration. The air ceased to double expose. Vox networks reasserted standard delay, and Auspex stopped showing ghosts as 9 timelines collapsed into one with mathematical precision. We stood in the ruins of Omnissiah's recursion under a sky that showed stars in their correct positions for the first time in nearly a millennium, survivors of a battle that had never officially occurred. The final silence struck not as absence but as conclusion, reality ceasing its temporal stutter as we faced the horrifying realization that we were the only ones who retained memories of the alternate timelines. Everyone else in the emerging singular reality would remember only the consolidated version of events, their consciousness edited to maintain coherence within the new timeline. We had become living repositories of histories that never were, archivists of condemned mercies and refused perfections, walking proofs that the past is both weapon and prayer. The weight of unremembered histories pressed against our consciousness like the attention of the God Emperor himself, and we understood that we would carry this burden until our own deaths finally released the rejected timelines into the silence of eternal forgetting. In the distance, an orbital platform began its incandescent descent, and I knew with cold certainty that we had saved a future no one else would know had needed saving. Silence settled over Omnissiah's recursion, with the clinical finality of life support systems shutting down, reality stabilizing into singular temporal state through processes that resembled surgical recovery more than physical law. Tertius 9 existed in one timeline for the first time in nearly a millennium, but the planet writhed in systemic failure as infrastructure dependent on temporal paradoxes began dying like organs deprived of blood. Manufactorums that had operated through recursive energy loops fell silent with mechanical death rattles, while conveyor systems ground to permanent halt, their perpetual motion finally succumbing to entropy's honest mathematics. My chronolith, permanently integrated with my nervous system, throbbed with the rhythm of temporal healing as I documented the universe's adaptation to singular causality through biological metaphors made manifest in cosmic processes. Contradictions dissolved like infection being purged from wounded flesh, while paradoxes smoothed themselves into coherent reality through mathematical sutures that left space-time scarred but functional. The air tasted of ozone and old copper without chronometric distortion's metallic bite, each breath carrying atmosphere that had finally learned to age properly rather than cycling through eternal recursion. Colonel Voss stood among the ruins with his remaining Death Corps soldiers, their disciplined formation maintained despite psychological trauma that transcended conventional combat stress. They struggled with survivor's guilt not merely for fallen comrades, but for alternate versions of themselves who had made different choices across 9 collapsed timelines. Sergeant Corrin saluted empty air, where officers had stood in other possibilities, his movements precise, despite tears freezing on his respirator grill. The weight of unremembered sacrifices pressed against their consciousness like phantom limbs, creating grief for losses that had never officially occurred, yet remained real in memory's sediment. The city's machine spirits began shutting down in cascading failure that mirrored organic decay, their consciousness patterns finally released from temporal loops that had sustained artificial life beyond normal operational parameters. Servo skulls fell from predetermined flight paths like mechanical snow, while servitors collapsed at their stations, augmetic systems powering down with last rites' finality. The symphony of automated industry that had played for centuries faded into genuine death's silence, creating acoustic emptiness that made our footsteps echo with unnatural clarity through corridors that had forgotten proper sound, absorption. Evidence of our actions' consequences beyond Tertius 9 emerged through fragmentary Vox transmissions as other temporal anomalies began resolving themselves through sympathetic resonance. Forge World Metallica reported manufacturing loops finally breaking after centuries of recursive production, while the Cadian Gate experienced causality normalization that disrupted defensive protocols, calibrated for temporal warfare. Warp travel became increasingly unstable as navigators struggled to plot courses through spacetime that no longer bent according to familiar paradoxes, their calculations requiring constant revision as reality healed its wounds. Astropathic communications suffered systematic interference as spacetime's healing created psychic pressure waves that disrupted choir synchronization across multiple sectors. Messages arrived fragmented, their temporal sequencing scrambled by the universe's adjustment to singular causality, while psychers throughout the region experienced prophetic dreams of futures that would no longer manifest. The Astronomican's light flickered as it adapted to navigating spacetime without temporal anchor points, creating brief periods of warp blindness that stranded vessels between stars. We discovered survivors in the city's deepest levels, tech priests and servitors who had existed in temporal stasis, their consciousness suspended between moments for nearly a millennium. Their emergence into linear time triggered cascading psychological collapse as minds adapted to recursive existence suddenly experienced forward progression without predetermined loops' safety. Many descended into madness, their augmetic systems overloading as they attempted to process causality that flowed in only one direction. Others achieved transcendent understanding, weeping sacred oils as they experienced genuine surprise for the first time in centuries. Dominus Keth III lay motionless near a ruptured data spire, his augmetics dark, but emanating a faint rhythmic hum that testified to crucial stabilization he had provided during the cascade. Sacred oils had crystallized in fern-like patterns across his robes, while his cortical stacks ticked quietly like a metronome in an empty chapel. His consciousness, perhaps forever fragmented across the 9 timelines, he had helped consolidate into singular reality. The arrival of an Ordo Chronos extraction team announced itself through temporal signatures that my altered awareness detected long before their ship appeared on conventional auspex. The Inquisition vessel, Eternal Moment, translated from warp space with mathematical precision, its hull bearing chronometric shielding that created brief distortions in local causality. Inquisitor Valeria Sec materialized in the extraction bay with fluid grace, her temporal scars forming patterns that suggested decades of chronometric exposure. When she spoke, her words arrived with absolute authority, while carrying harmonics that made nearby metal surfaces vibrate in sympathetic resonance. Adept Malleus, your chronometric integration has progressed beyond reversible parameters. The Ordo Chronos requires your permanent service. The realization struck with surgical precision as I understood that my temporal awareness had been permanently altered, making me valuable to the Inquisition, but forever separated from normal human existence. I could perceive causality as geometric patterns written in living light, yet this gift came with isolation's cost, as linear existence felt increasingly foreign, while my consciousness operated according to principles that transcended conventional time flow. We had saved a future no one else would remember needing salvation, and I faced eternity as guardian against paradoxes that most of humanity would never know existed. The eternal moment processed us through quarantine protocols that resembled liturgy written in administrative forms, each procedure stamped with seals that made the parchment feel heavier when held. Inquisitor Valeria Sek's briefing unfolded with the methodical precision of a medici examining infected tissue, revealing temporal contamination spreading throughout imperial space, like a plague that fed on causality itself. Tertius 9 was designated chronometric infection site, Gamma 7, she declared, her temporal scars shifting as chronometric pressure focused through her presence. 17 additional sites require immediate intervention across 9 sectors, each representing attempts by various entities to weaponize time against the Imperium's foundation. The institutional machinery of the Inquisition transformed heroism into file designations through procedures that felt like surgical operations performed on identity itself. We signed the writ of temporal custody with inks that smelled of electroplated incense, swore the sanctioned litany for non-linear witnesses, and submitted to Protocol 9 Sigma, which required laying our names upon plates that would never be filed in any archive accessible to ordinary servants of the throne. The Ordo designated us Mnemosyne cohort, keepers of hours that never were, individuals permitted to remember pruned possibilities while simultaneously arranging our cover deaths for regimental rolls and lineship logs. The cost of our victory crystallized through medical examinations that revealed permanent alterations to consciousness itself. We could never fully integrate back into normal imperial society, as our memories of alternate histories made us walking contradictions to the official timeline. Standard imperial citizens experienced reality as singular narrative, while we carried awareness of branching possibilities that created cognitive dissonance in prolonged social contact. Letters we might send to relatives would either fail to arrive or be read by versions who had never known us, the Ordo encouraging forgetfulness through gentle lies and administrative attrition. Colonel Voss received new orders. With the inevitability of gravity, his Death Corps regiment redesignated as Temporal Containment Maniple 447. Their conditioning for suicide missions made them ideal candidates for paradox resolution operations, where conventional tactics failed against enemies who could undo attacks by altering the timelines in which they occurred. His remaining troopers accepted their new role with characteristic stoicism, their discipline allowing adaptation to warfare against opponents who existed in multiple temporal states simultaneously. They would defend not just imperial territory, but the integrity of imperial history itself, their willingness to sacrifice for the emperor extending across multiple timelines. My chronometric abilities continued evolving through specialized Ordo Chronos training, allowing detection of chronometric scars where alternate timelines had been pruned from reality's tree. These wounds in causality appeared as geometric patterns, visible only to enhanced temporal awareness, pallid seams in the air marking locations where significant historical changes had been prevented or reversed. In hab corridors, I perceived echoes of doors that had never been hung, on ward walls outlines of saints' plaques whose inscriptions we had unsaid, creating a constant reminder of the universe's hidden complexity. Dominus Keth 3, restored to functional status through extensive augmetic reconstruction, served as our technical specialist while bearing permanent scarring of temporal integration across 9 iterations, Sacred oils wept continuously from his joints in patterns matching temporal fluctuations, making him a living barometer for causality distortions, while his vox grill produced binharic hymns in harmonies that existed outside conventional musical theory. His consciousness operated according to principles that transcended linear existence, allowing interface with chronometric equipment that would drive normal tech priests to madness. The philosophical implications pressed against consciousness, like the weight of the God Emperor's attention, as we learned our role as guardians of singular reality among infinite possibilities. We existed to defend a specific arrangement of joys and horrors, chosen not because it was perfect, but because it persisted. Our awareness of rejected futures, creating the burden of eternal vigilance against paradoxes that most of humanity would never perceive. The lex mechanics spoke in actuarial terms of acceptable variance and catastrophic drift, while confessors framed it as heresy's mirror, a refusal of false paradises and tolerance for pain in service to larger continuity. Throughout the galaxy, other entities attempted manipulations similar to the Chronarch's recursive paradise. Chaos sorcerers sought to alter outcomes of ancient battles. Xenos Archaeotech created temporal loops to preserve dying civilizations, and rogue psychers achieved chronometric transcendence that threatened local space-time stability. Each infection required intervention by individuals capable of perceiving temporal anomalies while maintaining coherent identity despite exposure to multiple timeline variations. We learned the vocabulary of temporal forensics, causality bleed, probability eddies, historical drift, and event horizon pruning. A new horror began manifesting during our debriefing cycles as our memories of the rejected timelines slowly faded. The universe itself, like a vast organic entity, was beginning to forget possibilities that were never realized, smoothing over contradictions until only singular, agreed-upon reality remained. I could no longer recall specific details of alternate versions of myself, but retained awareness of their existence as phantom sensations, muscle memory of actions never performed, emotional responses to experiences never lived, tactical knowledge from battles never fought. The fading created relief and loss simultaneously, as psychological burden decreased while our connection to rejected possibilities grew more tenuous. The first new mission briefing arrived through encrypted data crystals that activated only under specific chronometric conditions, revealing temporal anomalies in the Cadian system that suggested chaos attempts to alter outcomes of future Black Crusades. Reports indicated time distortion fields around strategic fortifications, causality inversions affecting supply lines, and astropathic communications arriving before being sent. The pattern matched theoretical models for large-scale temporal warfare, suggesting the archenemies of mankind had learned from the Chronarch's failure and were developing new approaches to historical revision. As we prepared for deployment, I understood that we had become something unprecedented in imperial history, guardians of time itself, tasked with preserving the singular timeline that allowed humanity to exist as more than mathematical probability. Our victory over the Chronarch had saved the future, but the price was eternal vigilance against infinite possibilities that pressed against reality's boundaries, like hungry predators seeking weakness in causality's defenses. We were the keepers of hours, and our duty would continue until the heat death of the universe finally resolved all temporal paradoxes into the silence of absolute entropy, defending an imperfect present against the terrible temptation of perfect alternatives. The revelation struck with the weight of absolute truth as I stood in the chronometric chamber of the Ordo Chronos vessel Immutable, understanding finally that time was not the river flowing toward entropy that imperial doctrine described, but a battlefield where order and chaos fought for control of causality itself. My new rank, Chronos Inquisitor Vex Malleus, carried authority over moments rather than worlds, responsibility for preserving the singular timeline that allowed humanity to exist as more than mathematical probability written in the void between stars. The immutable existed in temporal displacement exactly 3.7 seconds behind standard imperial chronometry, creating a vessel that sailed through causality's wake rather than its current. Her corridors bore the weight of eternal vigilance as bulkheads aged centuries in heartbeats before snapping back to pristine condition. Conversations looped upon themselves before resuming from points further in the future, and the air itself tasted of ozone and possibilities that had been carefully pruned from reality's tree. We lived in the interval between ticks of a cosmic clock, deploying into moments that shuddered under temporal pressure, returning before echoes faded into the silence of forgotten hours. Colonel Voss entered the chamber with mechanical precision, his death core having evolved beyond normal human soldiers into temporal warriors capable of fighting enemies across multiple timelines simultaneously. Temporal containment. Maniple 447 bore their new designation with characteristic stoicism. Their conditioning for suicide missions expanded to include willingness to sacrifice not just their lives, but their very existence across alternate realities. When they moved through the ship's corridors, their steps fell slightly out of sync with linear time, allowing them to engage opponents who existed in multiple temporal states, while maintaining tactical cohesion through disciplines that violated every principle of conventional warfare. Dominus Keth III served as our technical anchor, permanently scarred by temporal integration, yet functioning with augmetic systems that processed causality as raw data. Sacred oils wept continuously from his joints in patterns matching cosmic expansion, while his consciousness operated according to principles that transcended linear existence. Through him, we interfaced with chronometric equipment that monitored the galaxy's temporal health, like Medici watching vital signs of a patient whose illness was existence itself, tracking probability cascades and causality fluctuations that would drive normal humans to madness through their sheer complexity. The cost of our new existence revealed itself through daily operations, as each mission required witnessing and rejecting alternate timelines, gradually eroding our humanity while strengthening our resolve to defend singular reality. We had become something unprecedented in imperial history, temporal guardians who sacrificed connection to linear existence to preserve causality's stability. The constant exposure to infinite permutations of despair and triumph wore away the sharp edges of our identities, making us less human but more function, our minds reshaped by the volume of impossible realities we processed with each intervention. Our vigil encompassed the entire galaxy through monitoring stations that tracked chronometric disturbances across 9 galactic sectors, each screen displaying temporal data streams that revealed decision points where history could branch into infinite variations. Through augmented awareness, I perceived time as geometric patterns written in living light, fractal structures representing moments where the universe chose between competing possibilities, each choice defended by our eternal watchfulness against entities that sought to impose their own visions of perfection upon reality's foundation. The recurring motif of 9 achieved ultimate significance as we learned our mission at Tertius 9 had been the 9th such operation, completing a cycle that began with the formation of the Ordo Chronos itself during the dark years following the Horus heresy. 9 chronometric infection sites resolved, 9 temporal crises contained, 9 teams of guardians created to defend reality's singular thread against infinite alternatives. The pattern suggested not coincidence, but design. The universe organizing resistance to temporal manipulation through mathematical precision that bordered on divine intervention, each completion marking not an ending, but the moment a circle remembered how to become a spiral. We spoke the vocabulary of temporal existence with casual familiarity: causality bleed, probability eddies, historical drift, and event horizon pruning, terms that bridged theology and physics while describing our duties as priests of time itself. Our prayers included litanies for temporal stability, our sacred oils blessed with chronometric resonance that helped anchor consciousness during exposure to alternate realities. We defended the Emperor's vision, not just in space, but across the 4th dimension, where his light illuminated singular truth among infinite deceptions that pressed against causality's boundaries, like hungry predators seeking weakness in existence's fabric. Through the chamber's primary display, alerts cascaded from monitoring stations throughout Imperial space as temporal anomalies manifested with increasing frequency. Chaos forces had learned from the Chronarch's failure, developing new approaches to historical revision that required constant vigilance. Xenos Archaeotech created probability loops, rogue psychers achieved chronometric transcendence, and ancient mechanisms activated by unknown triggers began manipulating causality in ways that threatened local space-time stability. Each crisis demanded intervention by individuals capable of perceiving temporal distortions while maintaining coherent identity despite exposure to multiple timeline variations. The weight of maintaining the true timeline pressed against consciousness like the attention of the God Emperor himself, knowing that countless alternatives existed where humanity might have achieved greater glory or suffered worse damnation. Yet we endured because we had witnessed the cost of perfect salvation, humanity existing as temporal puppets dancing to equations written in their genetic code, free will sacrificed for the beautiful prison of predetermined paradise. Our imperfect present preserved the possibility of genuine growth through struggle, the chance to become something greater than the sum of programming. Standing before instruments that monitored time's flow throughout the galaxy, I understood that our victory at Tertius 9 had marked not an ending, but a beginning. My chronolith, permanently integrated with nervous tissue, pulsed with the rhythm of cosmic expansion as new alerts appeared on monitoring screens. Somewhere among the stars, another temporal crisis was manifesting as entities sought to reshape history according to their own visions of perfection. The Cadian system showed increasing chronometric instability, probability cascades suggesting massive temporal manipulation attempts by forces that sought to alter outcomes of conflicts not yet fought. The eternal vigil continued, and we were its guardians, keepers of hours that preserved the singular timeline where humanity endured, imperfect but free, struggling toward an uncertain future rather than accepting the certainty of perfect imprisonment. In the darkness between stars, time itself was under siege, and we stood watch against infinite possibilities that would cost humanity its soul. The warp storms might have ended above the dead Forge world, but the war for time itself was truly unending. A conflict that would continue until the heat death of the universe finally resolved all temporal paradoxes into the silence of absolute entropy, and our duty would persist across every moment until that final hour when eternity itself learned to rest. End.